Hi, how are you? This is Dr. Judith. Today I want to share with you briefly about the story of Joseph. Joseph, the youngest son at this time, when the story is being told in Genesis chapter 37. At this point, he's the youngest child of Jacob. Joseph, as most people, if you know the story about him, is that he felt he had obviously been given desires and dreams, and he expressed those dreams and desires to his family members, especially his siblings, and of course they were not very pleased about him sharing these dreams that God had placed on his heart, that he was going to be mighty. We'll use that word right now. He was going to be powerful, and that in the telling of his dreams, he told basically the father and his siblings that they were going to bow down to him at some point in the future. Of course, no one took that they didn't appreciate it. They were very angry. His brothers, whom he had already been reporting on for his father, he didn't do this on his own. His father would ask for him to go and see what they're doing and come back and give him a report. So they already were angry with their brother Joseph, and they were definitely upset with him that on top of everything else that had been going on, here he was now coming to tell them that he saw a future where they would actually be bowing down to him. It troubled them, of course, and as most human beings, that's the way most of us would react. But when God is doing something in a person, and he's sending them to do something, it's not always appreciated by the people around them. And when the person who is being sent starts verbalizing their dreams and what God has put on their hearts, it can become really difficult for those around them. It can really become a pain, and depending on the dreamer's personality and the position in the family and all those nice things, it can become really difficult. Already Joseph was in a particularly difficult situation because his father clearly favored him over the rest of his siblings. He was born to Jacob and Rachel, whom he loved so dearly. And so because of Jacob's love for his Rachel, and Joseph being an issue of that relationship, he really was highly favored, we'll say, by Jacob. And in that regard, Jacob actually had a coat, as in the Bible said, a coat of many colors that he had made just for Joseph. So already Joseph is in a precarious situation. He's the favored one. He is already being treated by their father as if he's ultra special. And so he's in a position where, people usually become very angry with you in that kind of situation. So the brothers are already upset with him that the father shows favoritism. But then on top of that, Joseph goes, and obviously the Lord is dealing with Joseph. He's not necessarily aware. And the Lord has put these dreams on his heart, and then he starts telling, including his father, he starts telling them the dreams. And I truly believe that at 17 years old, Joseph had no idea what he was saying. He was just merely repeating what was, you will say, in his spirit. We'll say that right now. What was on his heart, what was on his mind. And obviously the Lord had placed these dreams in him, and he was repeating them as most teenagers would. Teenagers don't necessarily do a lot of thinking, thinking. They just kind of blurt things out. So that's what Joseph did. The story is really very powerful. It's a great story, and I've fancied myself a Joseph many times, because many times when you share your dreams with others, they can become very offended, especially when in the dream that you're having, they're in a lesser position than you are. It can become really hairy and difficult. So that's what Joseph did, and starts really in chapter 37 of Genesis, where they're explaining what he did. He told them about the dreams and all this stuff, and they became profoundly angry with him. And this led to him being thrown in a pit, him being sold to the Ishmaelites, really being sold into slavery. And his brothers actually then takes his coat, and they were going to kill him. That was the original plan, until one of the brothers stepped in. I think it was Reuben, stepped in and said, "No, we're not going to kill him. After all, he's our brother." And so they sell him into slavery, and they take and dip it in animal's blood to take it back to their father to explain this lie, that a ravenous animal had attacked Joseph, killed him, and this was all that was left of him, was his coat, dipped in animal blood. Of course, the father wouldn't have known that, but that was the plan, and that's what they did. They actually threw him in a pit. Later on, these Ishmaelites passed by, and he ended up being sold. And so he was sold into slavery. They went on back home and told the story to their father. What really gets me, though, and tomorrow we'll get more into the story, what really gets me with this is that these young men, after leaving their brother in a pit, after having him just like he never existed in their lives, after doing away with him, they actually sat down and ate a meal. That points to what the Bible says when it says the heart is deceitfully wicked. Join us again tomorrow. I'm Dr. Judith, and we'll talk some more about Joseph and his brothers, and how many times in our own lives we are sold or thrown into a pit by those closest to us, those we never would have thought would have done such a thing. And how do we deal with the people who treat us that way? We'll continue with the story tomorrow about Joseph and his brothers. Could you eat a meal? Could you sit down and eat a meal after you've known you've done something really, really mean-spirited, evil to a family member or a friend or even a stranger? Let's meet and talk again tomorrow. Until then, this is Dr. Judith. God bless. Hello there again. We're continuing, at least I'm continuing, with Joseph's story in chapter 37 of Genesis. Talking the last time that I shared with you, about, I think I ended on the note of how many times have you or anyone plotted, well, not anyone, let's say believers, let's say those who claim to be children of God and followers of Jesus Christ, how many times have we plotted against someone because of something we suppose they had, that we wish we had, that we're jealous or envious of their lives as we saw it? How many times have we done that? Certainly in the case of Joseph and his brothers, there was a lot of jealousy, a lot of issues there that caused them to treat him the way they did. And remember that every story in the Bible is a lesson for us to learn about our present circumstances. So that there's a Joseph in all our lives, there is a David and a Peter and Paul, the Apostle Paul. Every one of these people in the Bible that we read about, we are them, or we have relatives or friends who are like them. And so these stories are meant to help us not to make the same choices that these people did in those times. The Bible says clearly that for lack of knowledge a people perish. And so I'm finding out more and more that the more I read the Bible and the more I know the stories in the Bible, I am becoming more alert, alive spiritually. The more I know about the mistakes that these people made, is the less mistakes I'm making. And I pray the same is for you, or will be for you in due season. It is, the Bible is just not written as a historical book. It is a very powerful and ever evolving book in terms of how it impacts our lives and the ways that we can change and behave when we look at the lives of these people and learn from their mistakes. So we are at the point where Joseph has already been sold by his brothers, and he's been sold to the Ishmaelites, and is on his way to Egypt, as far as they know. And so we're at verse let's see, I think we're at verse 32. So now we're at verse 33. Verse 32, just to recap, is that they took his tunic and they sent a tunic of many colors. They brought it to their father and said, "We have found this. Do you know whether it's your son's tunic or not?" Now, which of us would not say that that was deceitful and misleading? They knew exactly whose tunic it was. They were about to launch into a really deceitful and vicious plot that they were willing to act out, even though they knew it wasn't true. I mean, they had launched out into very dangerous waters in terms of being honest and decent, and even towards their father, because now they're going to perpetrate a terrible lie that they had begun the moment they decided to throw Joseph into that pit. They decided, whether consciously or not, that they were going to go ahead and create a whole new plot, a whole new story about their brother Joseph, and most of this was due to jealousy and envy. They were jealous of their father's relationship with him. They were jealous that he thought so highly of Joseph that he made that special coat for him of many colors. And so even the coat, they violated it. I mean, I feel they violated the very coat. And the coat, in a sense, they did that to say it's not a big deal. I mean, they took this coat that was given to Joseph by his father because of his special love for him, and dipped it in animal's blood, a kid goat's blood. And so, in a sense, they were saying, no big deal. And then so they took the coat and asked the father, "Is this your son's coat?" Deceitful. And of course the father, verse 33 says, "And he recognized it," that's Jacob, "and said, 'It is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Without doubt Joseph is torn to pieces.'" Now they gave the father the impression that a wild beast had attacked Joseph, tore him to pieces, and all was left was this bloody coat. Now, the thing that's amazing, I can only go from my perspective. I guess when you're very distraught and very shocked and very saddened and very hurt and very angry, we don't think too well when those things happen. But you'd have thought that the father might have said, but it doesn't say the coat was torn. It doesn't say the coat was ripped. It never says that the coat, Joseph's coat of many colors, was torn. It just said it was dipped in blood. Now, Jacob, did not have the time or the sense, the attitude or the heart at that point to check to see, well, is this animal's blood? Is this my son's blood? Basically, though, I would have thought he would have said, well, if an animal tore him to pieces, what did the animal do? Take the coat off first? How did he get to do all of this damage to kill his son, and the coat was not torn? Interesting. Holy Spirit just gave me that. Very interesting. So in his sadness and his anger and his hurt and his frustration that his son, his beloved Joseph, is dead, of course Jacob is not thinking rationally. He's just feeling, and that's why many times I tell people feelings are important. We have to learn to deal with them and acknowledge them, but don't, by the grace of God, with his help, try your best to, even when you're feeling deep emotions, to let God guide where you can actually think about something and not just give in to the feelings. Because had Jacob stopped to think about why was the coat torn, it might have been a different story. But then again, I have to bring us back to this point. What God intended God was going to have. And in order for the story to be the way it should be, in order for the destiny of Joseph to be the way it was meant to be and ordained by God, Jacob had to believe the story about the coats, about Joseph being torn to pieces by a wild beast. He had to believe that, because had he not believed it, then he could have gone out on a manhunt to find his son, and that would have aborted or at least stalled Joseph's destiny. We're going to leave that there today until tomorrow, but I'll leave you with this word. How many times have we been a part of something regarding someone's destiny that we might have tried to push the envelope, in a sense, that we might have tried to, instead of accepting the circumstances and instead of accepting what is said to us, we might have gone about trying to prove that what was said to us was wrong, and thereby delaying or aborting God's plan, either for ourselves or for a loved one, because we jumped in too fast and decided we didn't want to believe what was being told to us. So basically, the way it is in order for Joseph to reach his destiny, in order for God to have his way in Joseph's life, Jacob had to believe the story about what his son said about his youngest son at that time. He had to believe the story in order for Joseph to reach his destiny. Until tomorrow, when we talk again, God bless. Welcome again. This is Dr. Judith. We were talking yesterday, I was sharing with you about Joseph in chapter 37 of Genesis. That's where the story about Joseph's life begins in the Old Testament. And we talked about, we just basically went over how this all started about Joseph getting in his brothers throwing him into a pit. And so now we are up to verse, chapter 37, verse 24. And I talked to you yesterday about how let me just tell you what verse 24 says. It says, "Then they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty. There was no water in it." And this is where I kind of left off when I asked the question, would you be able to do this and then go sit down and have a meal? Very interesting. Verse 25 says, "And they sat down to eat a meal." Amazing. You throw your brother into a pit, and then you sit down to have a meal. Then they lifted their eyes and looked, and there was a company of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels, bearing spices, balm, and myrrh on their way to carry them down to Egypt. Now, if you know the story of Joseph, that's where Joseph was headed. That's where his destiny was leading him. Of course, his brothers, nobody knew at that point what God's intentions were, but that's where Joseph was headed. Verse 26, "So Judah said to his brothers," this is one of Joseph's brothers, "Judah said to the other brothers, 'What profit is there to kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be up on him, for he is our brother and our flesh.'" So what the brother Judah is saying here is that, listen, we're going to get rid of him. We're going to use some other folks, the Ishmaelites, to get rid of our brother. But we're not going to put our hands on him. We're not going to harm him, but we're going to sell him off. And that's how a lot of us tend to do from time to time. We make deals with ourselves, and we think we make deals with God, where we're going to do something, but we're not going to do quite the bad thing. What we're going to do just this far and stop. And so it's still wrong whether they went, all the way and harmed him. It's still wrong that they were doing this to their brother. But that's how we tend to negotiate with ourselves. We make deals with ourselves. Well, I'll go this far and no further, and that way I'm not that bad a person, and I'm not that, my hands are not that dirty after all. But you know what? As they say, sin is sin, small sin, big sin, still sin. So this is what Judah says. And so he says this, verse 27, come and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh. Now it's amazing, he's still trying to cause harm to his brother, to their brother, but he's finding, little ways. Well, we're not going to go all the way. Verse 20, so he says, he's our flesh, and his brothers listened. Now his brothers listened, that simply means they were in agreement with what Judah suggested. They were going to go through and do exactly what he said. So they listened, meaning they were in agreement with what he was saying. Verse 28 said, then Midianite traders passed by. So the brothers pulled Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. So here was Joseph on the way to his destiny, on the way to fulfilling God's plan for him. Of course, Joseph had no idea. I'm sure he's 17 years old. He has no idea. I'm sure he already knew that his brothers were upset with him prior to this, but I'm also sure he didn't expect them to go this far. Who would expect that your brothers would want to throw you into a pit, then pull you out just so they could sell you to a bunch of traders? So can you imagine how frightened this 17-year-old might have been at this point? He doesn't know these people. These are strangers to him. And the brothers who said, they're saying, well, he's our flesh. Can you believe that? He's our brother and our flesh. Yet, after they threw him in the pit, they sat down and ate a meal. They sat down and ate a meal and then decided, well, you know what? We don't really want to go all the way, so we're going to take him out of the pit and we're going to sell him to strangers, traders. We're going to sell him. And that was it. That's their decision. That was verse 28 where it says they sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. Verse 29, then Reuben, another brother, returned to the pit. And indeed, Joseph was not in the pit. So obviously, Reuben was not around when the others decided to do this deed of selling him. So now Reuben is upset. And it says, Reuben returned to the pit, and indeed Joseph was not in the pit, and Reuben tore his clothes. And usually, during those times when you tore your clothes, you rented your clothes, it meant you were frustrated, you were angry, you were frightened, you were hurt, and you felt this was it. There was, you just spent. And so he felt hurt and sad and angry and all the rest of it. And so verse 30 says, and he returned, meaning Judah, and he returned to his brothers and said, the lad is no more, and where shall I go? So Reuben is saying, listen, Joseph isn't in the pit. Now, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? How am I going to deal with this? What am I going to tell Dad? I'm the oldest one here. I've got to report back and say what happened to our brother. Where did he go? I left him in the pit. And so, even in that, Reuben was more concerned about himself than he was for Joseph. He was concerned about what was he going to tell their father about where Joseph was. So verse 31 says, so they took Joseph's tunic, killed the kid of the goats, and dipped the tunic in the blood. Then they sent the tunic of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, we have found this. Do you know whether it's your son's tunic or not? And we'll stop there today. How many times have we willfully and maliciously planned to hurt someone, plotted the whole thing, did the whole plot, worked it out in our minds, thinking that God had no idea what we were doing. We were just doing this on our own. How many times have we plotted against someone simply because we thought they were more highly favored than we were? And how many times have we pretended that someone died or someone disappeared so that we could move on with our lives as if they never existed, simply because we were jealous, we were envious, or we hated them? Time for questioning. This is Dr. Judith. We'll see you again tomorrow. Until then, have an awesome day and God bless.